At my father's retirement ceremony, Major General Sterling pointed directly at me in front of everyone and declared, "She is a relic, a ghost in a jacket that stinks of failure. She does not belong here." My sister, Amanda, just smirked and whispered, "How pathetic, still trying to play the hero?" They had no idea this ghost was about to make the traitors pay for what they did. My name is Major Vicky Frost. I'm 43 years old, and I was sitting in the back corner of the glittering ballroom at the Fort Myer Officers Club, a ghost at my own father's retirement ceremony. The room was suffocating, the cloying scent of polished mahogany and expensive perfume, a nauseating mix of prestige and denial, clung to the air. Through the grand floor-to-ceiling windows, the neat white rows of Arlington National Cemetery stood in silent judgment, a stark reminder of a world far removed from the polite clinking of champagne flutes around me. My hand, steady and calloused, tightened around a heavy-bottomed glass of Jim Beam, a soldier's bourbon, cheap and honest. It was my anchor in this sea of phonies. On the polished dais, my father, Major General Richard Sterling, stood like a living statue of self-satisfaction, his chest puffed out, his dress blues immaculate. He was the man of the hour, a titan of the Pentagon. To everyone else, he was a hero. To me, he was the architect of my ruin. My presence was a deliberate act of defiance. My old field jacket, still faintly smelling of cordite and Afghan dust, was a silent accusation against the sea of pristine uniforms. It was a piece of a past he had tried to bury. Across the room, my sister, Amanda Sterling Hayes, caught my eye. She was immaculate in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly pay. A smug, pitying smirk played on her lips, a look that said everything. "You don't belong here." She was right. I knew it, but I wasn't here to belong. I was here to bear witness. Then my father paused his speech. The self-congratulatory drone stopped, and a thick, expectant silence fell over the room. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he might actually ignore me, that my silent protest would go unseen. But he did something worse. He used me. And sometimes, his voice boomed, dripping with a false, authoritative gravitas that made my stomach clench. To move forward, we must leave the relics of the past behind. His gaze, cold and sharp as a bayonet, found me in my dark corner and pinned me to the wall. He pointed, not with his finger, but with his entire being. Like my daughter, Vicky. A collective, uncomfortable rustle went through the crowd. "A ghost," he continued, his voice devoid of any warmth, "in a jacket that stinks of failure. She does not belong here." A ripple of polite, cruel laughter followed. It was the sound of Washington, D.C. closing ranks. I saw Amanda lean toward the senator's wife beside her, her whisper just loud enough for me to hear over the subsiding chuckles. "So embarrassing. Mother was right when she said she was a family mistake." My heart didn't break. It was already calloused over, a mass of scar tissue from years of similar cuts. It just turned cold, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones, steel cold. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, the burn of familiar comfort. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my retreat. Just as the smug silence began to settle again, the grand double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a decisive thud. The entire room turned. General David Maxwell, a 4-star living legend, strode in. He was the kind of man who didn't need to command a room. His presence simply owned it. The air crackled. Officers who had been lounging in their seats instinctively straightened their spines. Maxwell's eyes, famous for their piercing intensity, swept past my father without a flicker of recognition. They scanned the crowd, a predator searching for a specific target. And then they landed on me. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to my arm, where the edge of my chimera tattoo, a mythical beast of fire and shadow, was unintentionally visible below my rolled-up sleeve. A look of profound shock washed over his weathered face. The room held its breath. He took a step forward, and his voice, sharp as a razor and carrying the weight of 4 decades of command, cut through the suffocating silence. "Major Frost," he said my name, my rank. "I thought you were all KIA in the Korengal Valley." The words hit the room like a grenade. KIA, killed in action. A stunned, absolute silence descended. The polite smiles vanished from every face. My father stood frozen, his mouth agape, his carefully constructed performance shattered into a million pieces. Then something incredible happened. An old colonel in the front row, a man I'd never met, slowly rose to his feet. Then another officer and another. It started as a ripple and became a wave. Within seconds, every single uniformed officer in that ballroom was standing, their eyes fixed on me. The applause began, not the polite, political clapping from before, but a deep, rolling thunder of respect. It was the sound of soldiers honoring one of their own. They were applauding a ghost. My father looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The color drained from his face. He had lost control, completely. And I knew, as I stood there in the echoing applause, bathed in the light of a truth he could no longer contain. This was only the beginning, Korengal. The name itself is a memory forged in dust and fire. But the betrayal didn't begin in that valley. It began 10 years earlier, under the pristine Gothic arches of West Point, on a day that smelled of freshly cut grass and ambition. I remember the weight of his hands on my shoulders as he pinned the gold bars of a second lieutenant onto my collar. My father, his face, captured by a dozen news cameras, was a mask of immense pride. He leaned in close, his voice a low, resonant rumble, meant for the microphones and the history books. "Duty, honor, country, there is nothing more sacred, Vicky," he said, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "And remember this above all else, a soldier never leaves a comrade behind." That sentence became my creed. It was the bedrock of my identity, the core of the officer I strove to be. I believed in those words. I believed in him. Looking back now, through the haze of smoke and deceit, I see that moment for what it was. It wasn't a lesson. It was a performance. He wasn't speaking to me, his daughter. He was speaking to the other generals, to the politicians, to the American public. I was just a prop in his grand play, the centerpiece of his perfect military family portrait. That promise, like his love, was never a gift. It was a tool, another instrument, to be used in service of his career. A promise he would shatter with a single chilling command. The Korengal Valley was hell on earth, scraped out of the Hindu Kush Mountains. A desolate landscape of rock, dust, and ghosts. Operation Starburst was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission, high-value target, minimal resistance. That's what the intel said. The intel was a lie. We were inserted by Blackhawks at Ori 400 hours, the pre-dawn air cold and thin. The ambush came just hours later. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a perfectly orchestrated trap. The sky just exploded. The distinct thump whoosh of RPGs echoed off the canyon walls. A sound that rips the air and your courage apart. They rained down on us, tearing our formation to shreds. The ground bucked and heaved. I saw Sergeant Sarge Miller, the man who taught me how to field strip my rifle blindfolded, his laugh as rough as his hands, just go down, his body slumping behind a rock outcropping. He was just gone. Chaos erupted. It was a symphony of destruction, the crack of enemy fire from the ridges above, the answering staccato of our M4s, the screams of the wounded. Doc Evans, our medic, who always carried a worn photo of his 5-year-old daughter inside his helmet, was hit while trying to reach Miller. He fell, his aid bag spilling its contents onto the thirsty ground. My commander, Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man I respected more than my own father, collapsed beside me, a dark blossoming stain spreading across his chest. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Everything dissolved into a blur of instinct and training. We were caught in a kill box. The intel wasn't just wrong, it was catastrophically, fatally wrong. Or worse. A cold dread began to seep through the adrenaline. It felt like we had been deliberately marched into a slaughterhouse. The acrid smell of cordite and the sweet, coppery scent of blood filled my lungs. It was the smell of betrayal. I dropped to my knees beside Colonel Thorne, my hands pressing down hard on his wound, trying to hold his life in with sheer force of will. My fingers were slick and warm. "Stay with me, sir, stay with me," I yelled over the din. He was fading. I grabbed the radio handset, my voice cracking as I screamed into it, using the call sign for our unit's commander. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, this is Chimera Actual. We are compromised and overwhelmed, requesting immediate extraction. I repeat, we are overwhelmed." The line hissed with static. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one a lifetime. My heart hammered against my ribs. I waited for the calm, professional voice of the radio operator at Bagram Airfield. But that's not who answered. A different voice came through the speaker, a voice that cut through the static and the chaos of the battlefield. A voice I had known my entire life. But it was different now. It was flat, devoid of emotion, as foreign and chilling as the wind whipping through that valley of loss. It was the voice of my father, Major General Richard Sterling. "Extraction request is denied, Chimera Actual," he said, his tone as calm as if he were ordering lunch. "Hold your position, maintain radio silence, out." A final dry click. He had cut the connection. He had severed our lifeline. In that single sterile transmission, he had signed our death warrants. He had thrown his own daughter, his own men, into the fire and walked away. In that moment, as the sounds of the battle raged around me, a horrifying clarity washed over me. We weren't a special forces unit caught in a bad ambush. We were a sacrifice. We were the acceptable losses. We were the secret he had to bury in the dust of the Korengal Valley. I looked down at Colonel Thorne, his breathing shallow, and then at the bodies of my men scattered across the rocks. The promise from West Point echoed in my mind. A soldier never leaves a comrade behind. It was all a lie, a hollow, damnable lie. I hoisted my colonel onto my back, his weight a crushing burden. The fight for survival had just begun. I never got a hearing. There was no debrief, no formal inquiry, no chance to tell my side of the story. They didn't face me like a soldier. They erased me like a clerical error. The final blow came not on a battlefield, but in a plain brown manila envelope from the Department of Defense, delivered to my temporary apartment in Virginia. Inside, the crisp, impersonal letter detailed my medical discharge. The official reason, acute post-traumatic stress disorder. It cited my inability to effectively command. Cold, clinical words designed to turn a soldier into a patient, a warrior into a victim. They were stripping me of my career, my honor, and my truth, all with the stroke of a pen. Clipped to the top of the official document was a small yellow sticky note. The handwriting was my father's, neat and controlled. It held just 2 sentences. "Vicky, this is for the best. Let it go." For the best? For whom? For his pristine career, untouched by the messy reality of the war he helped orchestrate. Let it go. It wasn't advice, it was his final command. He wasn't just taking my career, he was trying to take my reality, to overwrite my memory with his sanitized version of events. He wanted the ghost of Korengal to fade away, and he was starting with me. So I drove. I pointed my old pickup truck west and didn't stop until the manicured lawns of Virginia were a distant memory, replaced by the vast empty skies of Big Sky country. I ended up in Montana, a place with enough wide-open space to scream and know that no one would hear you. With the last of my savings, I bought a small secluded log cabin at the end of a long dirt road, and I disappeared. For 7 years, I lived as a ghost. My days were spent at a local auto repair shop, a place of honest work and tangible problems. I learned the rhythm of engines, the feel of a wrench in my hand. The thick, greasy smell of motor oil was a welcome replacement for the scent of cordite that still lingered in my nightmares. It was a simple, exhausting existence that left little room for thought, but the nights were long. The nights belonged to the past. I'd sit on my porch with a bottle of bourbon, the cheap kind, and watch the stars appear in the ink-black sky. And I would remember. I'd replay every second of Korengal, searching for a logic that wasn't there, trying to piece together the fragments of the betrayal, the faces of my men, the sound of the RPGs, the cold finality in my father's voice over the radio. It was a relentless loop. Occasionally, my sister Amanda would call. Her calls were never to see how I was doing. They were check-ins, surveillance missions, disguised as sisterly concern. She'd ask if I was accepting reality yet. Her voice, dripping with false sympathy, would grate on my last nerve. "Vicky, Dad just wants what's best for you," she'd coo. "Don't make this any harder than it has to be." They didn't want me to heal. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to vanish into the silence they had created for me. And one brutal winter night, under the weight of a heavy snowfall and heavier memories, I almost did. The bourbon wasn't working anymore. The cold was seeping into my bones, a deep, soul-level chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I was close to the edge, closer than I had ever been, even in that valley of loss. Rummaging through an old footlocker, I found my mother's Bible. I'm not a religious person. My faith had been left behind on some forgotten battlefield, but I needed something, an anchor in the storm. My numb fingers flipped through the thin, worn pages, and they fell open to the Psalms. My eyes landed on the 23rd Psalm. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." I read the words again and again, not with faith in a God I no longer knew, but with a sudden, shocking clarity, a new understanding. I had walked through the valley of the shadow of death. I had survived, and I wasn't alone. My honor was with me. The memory of the men who had fallen was with me. The truth, the real, unvarnished, bloody truth, was with me. They had tried to bury it, but it was still there, inside me, a burning ember that had refused to be extinguished. That was the night the ghost of Montana began to stir. I poured the rest of the bourbon down the drain, the amber liquid disappearing into the white snow. The ritual was over. I walked back inside, the crunch of my boots the only sound in the silent world. I sat down, not on the porch, but at the old desk in the corner of my cabin. I booted up my laptop, its screen a sudden slash of light in the darkness. A new mission had begun. My war was not over. It had just gone quiet. I started my investigation the only way I knew how, by going on the offensive. My fingers flew across the keyboard, old skills returning with surprising ease. My first target, the secure medical archives of the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. I was no longer a ghost. I was a hunter. For nights that bled into weeks, my cabin in Montana was illuminated only by the cold blue glow of my laptop screen. The obsessive focus felt familiar, like being on a long-range patrol where the world shrinks to just the mission. The investigation became my entire world, a labyrinth of encrypted files and redacted reports. I slept in 2-hour increments, fueled by black coffee that tasted like ash and a cold, burning rage. Then, after countless dead ends, I found it. A single thread in a web of lies. The screen displayed a file from the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. The patient was listed as a John Doe, admitted 5 days after Operation Starburst. There was no facial photo, no name, just a series of medical charts. But then I opened the radiology files, an X-ray of a left shoulder, and there it was, an old, healed fracture on the scapula, a unique pattern of scarring on the bone that was as familiar to me as my own reflection. It was the signature wound of Colonel Marcus Thorne, an injury he'd sustained on a mission in Somalia years before. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat. He was alive. They lied. They hid him away, buried him under a mountain of classified paperwork, while they told the world he was gone. My father had orchestrated the entire thing. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought a glacial fury that settled deep in my soul. He hadn't just left us to be eliminated. He had twisted the truth, erased a decorated officer from existence, all to protect himself. He had made Thorne a ghost, just like me. The digital proof was one thing, but I needed human confirmation. I needed someone who was there, someone whose memory couldn't be altered or deleted. My mind immediately went to one man, Andre Cole, my first sergeant, a soldier from the tough streets of Detroit, a man as hard as flint, with an eye for detail, sharper than anyone I'd ever known. I had to admit, Cole and I were never close. I'd kept a professional distance, the classic mistake of a young commander too focused on the mission, forgetting the people who execute it. It was a cold truth I couldn't deny, a regret I'd carried with me into exile. The long, monotonous drive to Chicago gave me time to think about it. The endless miles of asphalt, a reflection of my own single-minded past. I found him running a small, gritty boxing gym in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a place dedicated to keeping street kids out of trouble. When I walked into the gym, the air hit me like a physical blow, thick with the smell of sweat, worn leather, and raw determination. It was the smell of a fight. In the center of the room, Cole stood in the ring, his powerful frame silhouetted by the overhead lights. He was coaching a young kid, his voice a low, steady rumble of encouragement. He saw me standing by the door, and his eyes, dark and knowing, met mine. There was no surprise in his gaze, no shock, only a quiet, solemn sense of expectation. It was as if he'd known, all along, that this day would eventually come. He finished with the kid, then jerked his head toward a small, cluttered office in the corner. We sat on 2 rickety chairs, the rhythmic thud of speed bags providing a steady backbeat to our silence. "I've been waiting for you, Major," Cole finally said, his voice as steady as I remembered. "I knew how Sterling got rid of you. He did the same thing to me." My breath caught in my throat. Cole explained that he'd been forced into early retirement a year after Korengal. His crime? He had questioned the logic of a command decision during a debriefing. A decision that had Sterling's fingerprints all over it. "That man doesn't want soldiers," Cole said, his voice laced with a bitter, hard-earned wisdom. "He wants pawns, pieces on a chessboard he can sacrifice." I slid my laptop across the desk and showed him the X-ray. He leaned in, studying the screen for a long moment. He didn't need me to explain. He just nodded slowly, a grim understanding settling on his face. "I knew it," he breathed. "Some things just didn't add up." He stood, walked over to a battered gray metal locker, and opened it with the satisfying click of a key from the chain around his neck. From beneath a pile of old gear, he pulled out a worn black and green logbook, the kind every NCO keeps. "I don't have digital proof like you, Major," he said, placing the book on the desk between us. "But I have names." He opened it. The pages were filled with his neat, blocky handwriting. A list of every good soldier I knew who got medically discharged or pushed out for disciplinary reasons after crossing paths with Sterling, every one of them a top-tier operator. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with a righteous fire that matched my own. "We're not the only ones, Major. We're a forgotten army." Those words hung in the air, heavy with years of injustice. For the first time in 7 years, I no longer felt like a ghost. I wasn't alone. A few weeks after my meeting with Andre Cole, I was back in the quiet isolation of my Montana cabin, but the silence felt different. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating blanket of despair. It was the charged stillness of a mission being planned. Cole's list of names, the Forgotten Army, sat on my desk, a constant, tangible reminder of my new purpose. Hope was a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling, but it was there, a fragile seedling pushing its way through frozen ground. That's when my phone buzzed, vibrating against the scarred wood of the table. An unknown number from a DC area code. I almost ignored it, letting it go to voicemail as I had for 7 years. But a soldier's instinct, a gut feeling that this was incoming, made me answer. "Vicky, darling." The voice was syrupy sweet, a weaponized charm so foreign in my world of Greece and solitude that it felt like a violation. It was my sister, Amanda. In 7 years, she had never once initiated a call. A cold knot of suspicion tightened instantly in my gut. "It's been too long, it really has," she cooed, her insincerity a palpable force. "Dad and I are just so worried about you, all alone out there. We were thinking, why don't you come home for dinner this weekend? Just family, a real family dinner." Just family. The words were a warning flare, a prelude to an attack. I knew with the chilling certainty of a soldier sensing an ambush that this was not an olive branch. It was a reconnaissance mission on their part, a trap. My father never admitted mistakes. He only managed threats, neutralizing them before they could grow. He must have heard something through the Washington grapevine, a whisper about a ghost asking questions. Maybe he knew I'd found Cole. This dinner wasn't about reconciliation. It was about damage control, a foolish younger part of me, the part that still craved a father's approval, wished it were true, but the Vicky who survived Korengal knew better. You don't get a second chance to trust a snake. "I'll be there," I said, my voice deliberately flat and even. Sometimes the best way to gather intelligence is to accept their invitation and walk right into the enemy's camp. Amanda's home was a stately brick townhouse in Georgetown. a monument to power and old money where political secrets were traded over cocktails. The air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon polish and a level of entitlement I'd forgotten existed. The dinner itself was a masterpiece of culinary deception. The table was set with heirloom silver and crystal that probably cost more than my truck. We had beef Wellington, the pastry a perfect golden lattice, served with an expensive Cabernet Sauvignon that tasted like ashes in my mouth. Everything was flawless, and everything was cold, especially the company. The conversation was a carefully choreographed performance, and I was the ghost at the feast. They talked around me as if I were a distant relative they were obligated to host. My father pontificated about national security, name-dropping senators with casual arrogance while swirling his wine. Amanda chattered about her new charity foundation and the floral arrangements for an upcoming gala. They spoke of a world of influence and appearances, a world so far removed from my own. They talked about everything except the 7 years of my life they had stolen, the men who had fallen, the truth they had buried. They were acting out a play about a happy, successful family, and I was the unwelcome, invisible witness. I played my part, offering non-committal grunts and short answers, my mind a tactical map, analyzing their every move. After the plates were cleared by a silent housekeeper, my father leaned back, steepling his fingers. The performance was over. The real meeting was about to begin. "Vicky," he started, his voice adopting a tone of paternal concern that was utterly fraudulent. "I know life in Montana must be difficult. It's no place for a woman of your talents. Amanda and I have been thinking, we're family, and family should take care of each other." His eyes, however, held no warmth. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a general assessing a problem on a map. I was the problem that needed to be neutralized. Amanda seamlessly picked up the cue, her voice smooth as silk. She slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished mahogany table. It landed in front of me with a soft, final thud, a sound of containment. "This is a trust fund, Vicky," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "It's substantial, enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. No more greasy work at that garage." She gestured toward my father. "And Dad has already spoken to some friends. He can arrange a position for you. A senior security consultant role at a major defense corporation. A quiet desk job, a 6-figure salary, a chance to start over, to leave the past behind." She paused, letting the offer hang in the air, a glittering, poisonous lure. Her smile widened, and in it I saw the face I knew all too well, the smug, satisfied face of a victor. "All you need to do," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is sign here. It's just a standard non-disclosure agreement, a formality really, just to protect the family's privacy, of course." There it was, the poison pill wrapped in gold leaf. They didn't want to heal the wounds. They wanted to gag me. They wanted to buy my silence, my truth, my honor. They had put a price tag on it. As she spoke, the names flashed in my mind like dog tags glinting in the sun. Thorne, Miller, Evans. I remembered Evans showing me the picture of his daughter. They wanted me to sign a paper that would betray his memory, that would bury them all over again, this time under a pile of blood money. The quiet, simmering anger that had been my constant companion for 7 years was no longer simmering. A volcanic heat rose in my chest, the blood pounded in my ears, the cold steel in my heart was heating up, glowing red-hot, ready to be forged into a weapon. I stared at the leather-bound folder, this bribe dressed up as salvation. A thick, oppressive silence filled the room, heavy with the weight of their expectations. Then I looked at their faces, my father's rigid and smugly confident. My sister's, a mask of pity so condescending it was a weapon in itself. A sound escaped my lips, startling them. It wasn't a word, it was a laugh, not a sound of amusement, but a dry, harsh, grating sound, like metal scraping against bone. "My honor is not for sale," I said, my voice dangerously calm, each word a carefully placed stone. "And the honor of the men who perished in Korengal is certainly not for the two of you to purchase with blood money." The mask of paternal concern on my father's face evaporated, replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered fury. His jaw tightened, and his eyes, which moments before had been feigning warmth, turned to chips of ice. The real man was finally showing himself. "Don't be naive, Vicky," he snarled, his voice a low growl that vibrated with menace. "They're gone. What value does the honor of the dead have compared to the future of this family?" That was it. The final desecration. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. He hadn't just betrayed the living, he now stood and spat on the graves of the dead, dismissing their ultimate sacrifice as a mere inconvenience to his ambition. The dam of my restraint, built over 7 years of silent suffering, didn't just crack, it exploded. The rage that erupted in me wasn't hot and loud, it was ice-cold and silent, a killing calm that sharpened all my senses and made the opulent room feel like a tactical grid. "Value?" I repeated, the word tasting like poison. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, and stood. My movements were slow, deliberate, the posture of a soldier on the offensive. I met his furious gaze without flinching. "It has more value than your entire career, General. More value than every star on your shoulder and every medal on your chest. It has more value than all of Amanda's money. It's all we have left when everything else is stripped away." I raised my hand and pointed a single steady finger at him, the gesture an accusation. "You lectured me my entire life about duty, honor, country. But you, sir, know nothing of those words. You use them as a shield. You are not a soldier. You are just a politician in a uniform, a costume you wear to hide the hollow man inside." My gaze shifted to Amanda, who looked genuinely shocked that the family ghost would dare to speak back. "And you," I said, my voice cutting through her bubble of privilege, "you're worse. You know the truth, yet you stand here and choose to be his accomplice. You two deserve each other." I turned and walked toward the grand entryway, my back straight, my boots making no sound on the plush oriental rug. The silence I left behind me was more damning than any shout. I didn't look back. "This is the last time," I said, my voice ringing with the finality of a gavel strike. "The last time you will ever try to silence me. The game is over." My hand was on the heavy brass doorknob when I paused, a final thought surfacing, a piece of a better man's wisdom. I turned my head slightly. "By the way, Dad," I said, letting the word hang in the air with all its bitter irony. I still remember what General Patton said. It is better to fight for something than to live for nothing. I let the silence stretch, then delivered the final blow. I've finally found my something to fight for. Have you ever reached that point? The point of no return, where the only way forward is through the fire? That was where I was, and I will not stop. I walked out into the cool, humid DC night, leaving the wreckage of their perfect family dinner behind me. I didn't go back to my hotel. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour coffee shop in the Virginia suburbs, a brightly lit, anonymous place that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Under the humming fluorescent lights, I sat in a booth in the back, the cracked vinyl cool against my skin. I opened my laptop. The screen came to life, a beacon in the dim light. My hands were steady as I composed a short, concise email to the personal, encrypted address of General David Maxwell. I attached 2 files. The first was the X-ray of Colonel Thorne's shoulder. The second was a short but damning audio file I had uncovered from a secure server. A recording of my father and an unknown contractor discussing the necessity of keeping Thorne's survival a secret. The subject line was simple, 3 words that carried the weight of 7 years of injustice: chimera, survivor, proof. My finger hovered over the mouse for a single heartbeat. Then I clicked send. The battle had truly begun. The email to General Maxwell was a declaration of war. The moment I hit send in that sterile 24-hour coffee shop, I transitioned from a ghost haunted by the past into a hunter shaping the future. The rage from my father's dining room had cooled, solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer just about my pain, it was about the truth. 2 days later, I received a 1-line encrypted reply: Arlington, noon, Section 60. I met General David Maxwell among the endless silent rows of white headstones at Arlington National Cemetery. Section 60 is where the fallen from Iraq and Afghanistan are laid to rest. The air here was heavy, sacred. It was a place where lies came to die. We walked without speaking for a time, the only sound the crunch of our polished shoes on the gravel path. He finally stopped and handed me a thick manila folder. The unredacted medical file for Colonel Marcus Thorne, he said, his voice a low, somber rumble. And this is what he wanted you to know. Maxwell's story filled in the gaps. After being secretly evacuated from Korengal, Thorne had recovered at Landstuhl. He chose to disappear into the civilian world, knowing that if he re-emerged, my father would use the full force of his power to crush them both, burying the truth forever. Thorne said he was too big a target to hide, Maxwell continued, his gaze fixed on a nearby headstone. He then turned to look directly at me, his eyes filled with a weary respect. But you, Major, he said you were small enough to slip through the cracks and sharp enough to strike. His exact words were, "She will be the one to ignite the flame of truth." Maxwell looked away, a deep sense of regret in his posture. "I've been ashamed of my silence for 7 years, Major. When the time comes, I will serve as a witness." Thorne's words, delivered by this living legend, became my new mission directive. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about fulfilling my commander's last wish. I flew back to Montana with a renewed, razor-sharp focus. I had the what. I needed the why. I needed the final, undeniable piece of evidence. I dove back into the digital ether, my mind replaying every detail of the Korengal timeline. I remembered a fragment of intelligence, a logistical anomaly I'd dismissed at the time. A last-minute diversion of a shipment of sensitive medical equipment out of Bagram Airfield. On the same day, Thorne vanished from the official records. It was a loose thread. I started pulling. For days, I lived on coffee and adrenaline, my fingers flying across the keyboard. My training in signals intelligence, skills I thought I'd left behind in the dust of Afghanistan, came flooding back. I followed the digital breadcrumbs from a military server in Bagram through a series of shell corporations to a heavily encrypted server belonging to a private military contractor with deep ties to the Pentagon and to my father. It was a digital fortress, but I found a crack, and inside I found it, the silver bullet. It was an audio file, a recording of a secure phone call. I heard my father's voice, calm and controlled. The other voice was unfamiliar, a civilian. "If she finds out Thorne is alive, she'll start digging," my father said. The other man asked, "Are you sure she won't be a problem?" And then came the words that ripped the last of my old wounds wide open. My father let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Vicky, she's too sentimental, too much like her mother. She'll never understand the hard decisions men have to make. I built this career from nothing. I'm not about to let my own daughter tear it down." He didn't see me as a soldier. He saw me as a sentimental fool, an emotional liability, a pale imitation of my mother. That recording wasn't just proof of a cover-up. It was the unfiltered truth of how he saw me. It was the weapon I needed. I called Andre Cole. He was on a plane from Chicago the next day. He brought with him a man he trusted implicitly, a retired JAG Corps lawyer named Marcus Bilal, a man with a reputation for taking on the Pentagon and winning. For 72 straight hours, the three of us worked out of the basement of my cabin, which we turned into a war room. We were a formidable team, the hunter, the soldier, and the lawyer. We assembled the evidence into pristine, undeniable packages. We copied everything, the original, unredacted, mission reports from Korengal, the X-rays, Cole's logbook with its damning list of the forgotten army, the financial records of the private military contractor, and the audio file, the silver bullet itself. We wrote a detailed analysis of my father's forged signature on dozens of medical discharge orders. We didn't aim for a single target. We aimed for them all. Using encrypted channels, we sent the anonymous packages to the top investigative reporters at the Washington Post. We sent them to key congressional aides on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We sent them to a military justice watchdog group known for protecting whistleblowers. I wasn't looking for a duel. I was starting a firestorm. We had planted the seeds of truth in the most fertile ground in Washington, D.C. Now all we had to do was wait for them to grow. The hearing room in the Pentagon was a theater of cold, imposing power. It was a place designed to intimidate, with its dark mahogany paneling, soaring ceilings, and the suffocating weight of the American military machine pressing in from all sides. The air itself seemed to hum with decades of secrets and grave decisions. But as I sat at the witness table, I felt no intimidation. I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years, a soldier's focus before a battle. I wore my service dress blues, the uniform crisp and perfectly pressed, my medals polished to a high gleam. They weren't just decorations, they were my armor, each one a testament to a part of my life they had tried to erase, a life lived in service, a life of honor. I was not here as a victim seeking pity. I was here as Major Vicky Frost, an officer of the United States Army, to report a crime against that very honor. Across the room, at the respondent's table, sat my father. He was a statue carved from granite and denial, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism. Beside him, acting as his counsel, was Amanda. She was the picture of predatory competence in a severe, expensive power suit, her legal pads arranged with geometric precision. She was no longer my sister, she was the enemy's frontline defense. In the gallery behind me, I could feel the steady, reassuring presence of General David Maxwell. He was my silent witness, his 4 stars a powerful counterweight to the 2 on my father's shoulders. A quiet promise that the truth would have its champion. At the head of the room, Senator John Reed, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, a man known for his sharp intellect and low tolerance for deceit gavelled the session to order. The room fell into a profound silence. "Major Frost," the senator began, his voice grave and resonant. "This committee has received a series of very serious and frankly disturbing allegations. The floor is yours." I took a deep, steadying breath, the air tasting of floor wax and history. The final act had begun. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," I said, my voice clear and even, carrying across the cavernous room without a tremor. I stood and walked the committee through the events of Operation Starburst, my presentation calm, clinical, and methodical. I laid out the facts like pieces on a chessboard. I presented the original mission briefing, highlighting the faulty intelligence that sent us into the kill box. I showed them the flight path analysis of the logistics transport that had secretly evacuated a John Doe from Bagram. I displayed the X-ray of Colonel Thorne's shoulder, its unique scarring undeniable, a ghost made real on the screen for all to see. Amanda was on her feet constantly, a blur of practiced objections. "Objection, Mr. Chairman. The witness is engaging in speculation." "Objection. This is hearsay." Her voice was sharp, desperate to poke holes in a narrative that was becoming increasingly solid and damning. "My client, Major General Sterling," she declared, her voice ringing with false sincerity, "acted at all times in the best interests of his country and his command." The chairman overruled her each time, his patience visibly thinning. Then, seeing her legal tactics failing, Amanda went for the jugular. She played her trump card, the weapon they had forged themselves. She held up a copy of my medical discharge papers. "Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit into the record the witness's own service file," she announced, her voice dripping with condescension. "A file which documents a clear and severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the testimony of an unstable soldier, a woman with unreliable trauma-induced memories." The room grew colder. She was using their lie to invalidate my truth. For a second, the humiliation of that diagnosis burned hot in my chest again. I took a breath, held her venomous gaze, and prepared my counterattack. "My memory may have been deemed unreliable by my father, Mr. Chairman," I said, turning to face her directly. "But what about the memories of the other soldiers?" I nodded to my counsel, Mr. Bilal. On the large screen behind the committee, a document appeared. It was Andre Cole's list. The Forgotten Army. More than 20 names, each one a decorated soldier, an exemplary warrior. And next to each name was the date of their separation from the service and the reason: medical discharge, disciplinary action. Every single discharge order was signed by one man, Major General Richard Sterling. A wave of shock rippled through the room. The reporters in the gallery began scribbling furiously, the sound like a sudden downpour. This was no longer one woman's story. It was a pattern, a systematic purge. "And now," I said, my voice dropping, commanding the absolute attention of everyone present, "I would like to play one final piece of evidence." The audio file began. The sound of my father's voice, calm, calculating, and utterly damning, filled the silent room. "If she finds out Thorne is alive, she'll start digging." Then the other man's question, and finally my father's contemptuous laugh, a sound that echoed the cruelty I'd heard my entire life. "She's too sentimental, too much like her mother. She'll never understand the hard decisions. I built this career. I'm not about to let my own daughter tear it down." The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing physical weight. Amanda's face was ashen. Her carefully constructed defense had been obliterated. There was nothing left for her to say. Every eye in the room, including the television cameras broadcasting the hearing live across the nation, turned to Major General Richard Sterling. He didn't move. He sat perfectly still, staring into the middle distance, his face a blank canvas. The titan of the Pentagon, the master strategist, had been outmaneuvered. He was defeated. Then, in the profound silence, he did something more eloquent than any confession. He slowly reached into the breast pocket of his immaculate uniform and withdrew a black Mont Blanc fountain pen, a symbol of his power and prestige. With a steady hand, he unscrewed the heavy gold cap. He leaned forward, and he drew a single thick black line through his own name on the brass nameplate that sat before him. Major General Richard Sterling. It was a deliberate act of self-erasure, a surrender. In that one silent motion, he had single-handedly destroyed the legacy he had sacrificed everything and everyone to build. The aftermath of the hearing was not a victory parade. It was a media firestorm. The story exploded across every news network, the name Sterling becoming synonymous with disgrace. My father, the titan of the Pentagon, quietly submitted his resignation. The official investigation widened, pulling more names and more secrets out of the shadows. The machine of justice, once I had given it a push, began to grind forward on its own. But I felt no triumph. In the quiet of my Montana cabin, with the vast, indifferent mountains as my only witnesses, the adrenaline of the fight drained away, leaving a profound emptiness in its wake. The war was over, but the silence of the battlefield was deafening. I had won, but what had I lost? A few days later, an email from Amanda appeared in my inbox. The subject line was simply family. There was no apology. There was only the bitter, venomous rage of a princess whose castle had been stormed. "Are you happy now, Vicky?" she wrote. "You've destroyed everything. You've destroyed this family. You've destroyed Dad's legacy. All for your selfish need to be a hero." I read the words, each one a poisoned dart, and felt nothing. Just a quiet finality. Her blindness was absolute. She couldn't see, would never see, that I hadn't destroyed our family. I had simply held a light up to the rot that had been festering in the dark for decades. Our family had been a casualty of my father's ambition long before I ever stepped into that hearing room. I was just the one who pulled the sheet off the corpse. I hit delete without a second thought. There was nothing left to say. A week later, a small, unassuming package arrived. A simple brown cardboard box with no return address, postmarked from a town in rural Virginia I didn't recognize. My instincts on high alert, I took it to my workshop, carefully slicing it open. Inside, nestled in bubble wrap, was a single old faded photograph. It was a picture of two young men in desert camouflage, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning under a harsh foreign sun. One was a young Richard Sterling, full of confidence and promise. The other was a young Marcus Thorne. They were friends once, brothers in arms, before ambition had poisoned everything. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the photograph over. On the back, there was a short sentence, written in my father's familiar script, though the letters were shaky, unsteady. He chose the wrong man that day, but not this time. It wasn't an apology. The words "I'm sorry" were not in his vocabulary, but it was something else. It was an admission, a concession, acknowledgement that he had been wrong and that I had been right. It was a signal from a distant, broken man, and it was all I needed. I didn't need his love or his remorse anymore. I just needed the truth to be acknowledged. I found an old wooden box where I kept my military mementos, my dog tags, a few challenge coins, the patch from my Chimera unit. I gently placed the photograph inside, alongside the ghosts of my past. As I closed the lid, I felt a chapter of my life click shut with it. I don't hate my father. I don't hate Amanda. Hate is a fire that consumes the person who carries it. And I had spent too long burning. I simply have no place for them in my life anymore. Forgiveness, I've come to realize, isn't about absolving them of their sins. It's not about inviting them back into my home for Thanksgiving dinner. Forgiveness is accepting that they are who they are, defined by the choices they made. And I am who I am, defined by mine. Forgiveness is the act of setting my own heart free from the corrosive burden of resentment. It is not for them because they don't deserve it. It is for me because I do. I fought my war. I reclaimed my truth. Now it was time to live. The quiet that followed the storm was different. It wasn't the empty silence of loneliness, but the peaceful stillness of a dawn breaking over a hard-won battlefield. The ghosts of Korengal had finally been laid to rest. My war was over. I sold the small log cabin, the fortress of my 7-year exile. With that money, and with some generous, anonymous support from a few benefactors, one of whom I suspected was General Maxwell, I bought a sprawling tract of land in a remote Montana valley, cradled by the rugged peaks of the Rockies. There I founded the Aegis Training Group. The name was deliberate. Aegis, the mythical shield of protection. Aegis wasn't a gym or a boot camp. It was a sanctuary, a place for the soldiers the system had forgotten, the men and women who had been discarded and labeled as broken or unstable. We didn't just teach them survival skills or tactical maneuvers, though we did that too. We taught them how to find their own value again, how to rebuild the honor that had been stripped from them. Andre Cole moved out from Chicago, his gruff wisdom and unshakable integrity making him the perfect head trainer. Together, we started to rebuild shattered lives, not with pity, but with respect, a shared understanding, and a new mission. We were forging a new kind of army, one built on healing. A few months after we opened, as the aspens in the valley were beginning to turn a brilliant gold, a dusty old pickup truck rumbled up our long driveway. A young woman, no older than 18, stepped out. She had a nervous energy about her, but her eyes were a perfect, startling reflection of a man I once knew. "Are you Major Frost?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "I am," I said, my heart giving a sudden, painful lurch. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Sarah Thorne?" The world seemed to stop for a beat. She was the image of her father. She held out a small sealed envelope. My hands trembled as I took it. Inside, I found the dog tags of Colonel Marcus Thorne, still intact, cool against my skin. "My dad, he told me to come here," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "He said if I ever wanted to learn what real courage looks like, I should come find you." She looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw not just grief, but a flicker of hope. "He also asked me to tell you something. He said he misses you." The tears I had held back for 7 years, through the loneliness, the rage, and the fight, finally fell. They weren't tears of sadness, but of gratitude, of a circle finally being closed. That evening, I sat before the crackling fire in the main lodge of Aegis, Thorne's dog tags cool and heavy in my hand. I finally understood. A legacy isn't your name carved onto a marble monument in Washington. My father had chased that kind of immortality, and it had turned to dust. A true legacy is the memory you leave in the hearts of those you fought alongside. It's the flame of hope you pass on to the next generation. It's the quiet impact you have on another person's life. I opened my laptop. The blank white screen glowed in the firelight. And I began to write. I wrote my story, the story of Chimera, of Thorn, of Cole, of Miller and Evans, of all the forgotten soldiers whose names had been erased. My final message wasn't for the powerful men in the Pentagon. It was for the soldiers still living in the shadows, the ones who had been told they were broken. Write your name in ink, I typed. Write it not to prove them wrong, but so that you are never forgotten. Let them read what they tried to erase. Let them see the truth you kept alive. I started writing that night, not just for my fallen comrades, but for myself. My story is now written in ink, a permanent record of the truth. But as I write, I know I'm not the only one. Perhaps my journey reminds you of your own. A time you felt overlooked, a battle you had to fight alone, a truth that deserved to be heard. That is why the Chosen Revenge Library exists. It is a sanctuary for stories of resilience, just like this one. If you believe one voice can make a difference, subscribe and follow our channel. Share your own thoughts in the comments below, because your story matters too.